Muslim young women that is involved in the study circle. She had been reading some of the Alinsky material. And she said, I'm puzzled because there's this emphasis on self-interest. She said, and there's no question about what forms the self. That we would say in Islam that what is essential is what forms the self. That the self is not formed in isolation, the self is formed in community. And what kind of community is it that forms the self? And what kind of historical community, not just current community, is it that forms the self? And that's what's striking me from your stories, is that there's stories of people that are formed by something other than just the moment or the materialism of our society or even their own struggles in our society, that they're formed by something, a historical community. Their self is formed by historical community. And even not just their individual, but the community is formed by historical community, like you talk about the breaking into the Messiah. And it's drawing on those roots of formation, that grounding in that root of formation that you were describing.
And I would say on that theme, I mean, for me, that's as someone who also tries to be a student of history, that I find sort of the American experience as an immigrant to be full of these tensions and contradictions, or dialectics, if you will, that on the one hand, we are remarkable as a country for bringing together so many different people from so many different backgrounds and so many different countries. And so we really are, on one level, the quintessential collective, because we have drawn from so many different strands into something called America. And yet there's also this very deep-rooted American value of individualism that completely sort of dismisses that collective notion and somehow has this myth that each of us is individual and each of us only gets by our individual merit and our individual work, and sort of then completely dismisses that notion of the collective. And so part of, in an American context, I feel like, of trying to do social change work in the United States is really wrestling with those contradictions and what is it about how those themes have played out, and how maybe we restore some of the balance between those contradictory values.
The individual and the community.
Right.
So that actually brings me to the question, which is, clearly you're describing people being community together in the sanctuary movement in ways that maybe were not familiar. Even what you described in the church making a decision, or the congregation making a decision, that they were talking to each other in ways that they had never talked to each other. So becoming community. What I want to ask is, to what extent were people's faith traditions actually consciously informing their strategy, both their strategy around how to organize community and also their larger strategy about how to create social change? They were clearly drawing on their faith for inspiration and for direction, but were they drawing on their faith in an intentional, strategic way?
I would say a lot of that then played out differently in the different faith traditions. That in fact, in some of the Jewish communities, there probably is this greater notion of connecting what happens at temple with what happens in the rest of their lives. And so, again, the whole Jewish charities and the Jewish federations that also are very much secular at one point, but also obviously deeply rooted in the faith tradition of being a Jew. And so, in some ways, that bridge of this is a conversation about our social justice work that we're having at temple was very natural for many, many Jewish congregations in a way that it might not be natural for other Christian congregations. And then I think in some of the Catholic congregations that were moving to more intentional communities, especially the smaller parishes, and were already in the style of worship and the way they designed worship, moving more away from more hierarchical forms and much more collective forms. I think, again, the whole sanctuary discussion both reinforced and even propelled that. And I even saw, again, I'm not sure directly related to sanctuary, but then continued everything from the way that the physical church was redesigned for worship was, again, made much more inclusive and less hierarchical in that sense of where the altar was placed and all those kinds of things. And then I think in some of the Protestant communities, again, where, especially in some of the evangelical communities, you also have that tradition of justice work, but again, how much of that is brought within the church walls and how much of it is seen as sort of what you do the other 6 days a week. And so again, I think it played out differently, and it really pressed this issue of what I would call integration of do we hold those parts of our faith in separate pieces and on separate days?
How much does our faith inform our strategy?
Yes. Or is this also something that is core to what we do on the Sabbath and what we do on Sunday?
Marshall Gans, we interviewed Marshall Gans, which was quite an amazing interview. And he talked about the hard point around this understanding where faith impacts strategy. That in the movements that he was part of, Cesar Chavez and the Civil Rights Movement, and now he's relating that to Obama. But this question of where faith actually impacts strategy. And he talked a little bit about the movement into uncertainty. And some of what you were talking about with humility. You know, that part of how, at the minimum, how faith informs strategies, it makes us humble. It puts us in this global context, in this international historical context. It makes us a little more humble about our strategy. Was there a conversation in terms of the way sanctuary was actually done? You know, that the use of sanctuary as a strategy. But was that connected to people's faith traditions? How was it connected? How did that happen? Why sanctuary? You know, if you were going to respond out of your faith to immigrants facing potential torture and deportation, why sanctuary as a way of responding?
So I also think within the sanctuary movement there continue to be different levels, and again, without judgment of right or wrong, of just different ways that people understood and interpreted what sanctuary meant. That for some, it was more about the policy statement and the congregation or the community, the faith community taking that position. And for others, it also remained at less that and much more the pragmatic assistance of we could help one family. And yes, this may raise the broader policy issues, but this is also about the pragmatic shelter, assistance, housing that we might give to a family. And I think that whole continuum of understanding and engagement, if you will, and so each of those then raised larger issues of are we, again, as a community, and how do we deal with homelessness? How do we deal with, if we're at that pragmatic level, that it isn't just about a single family, but at that service level provision, there's a host of needs around us if we opened our eyes and did then...
Why these families rather than those
correct.
families?
And how do we then make that an ongoing part of what we do? And then at the policy level, again, it was the same thing. Okay, now we take a position on this. What else do we then need to take a position on? And what's the discernment process and dialogue process and decision-making process about all that? That again, it's not just about this, but it's about if we are going to be, again, consistent with our faith and driven by our faith and rooted in our faith to come to these decisions and take these positions, then do we take these public positions on a whole host of other issues that confront our society that are not just, that are not right.
The term sanctuary, of course, comes from the cities of refuge, what in the Book of Numbers. But was that part of the conversation, or by the time you came into it, people weren't really thinking about sort of the use of that frame or that symbol?
You know, the way that I sort of retraced it was people seized it as a term and as a metaphor, and then I think, again, there were folks like Gus Schultz from University Lutheran in Berkeley that actually had invoked it during the Vietnam War and consciously sort of re-invoked it. But I think there were many, many people that hadn't realized that it had that kind of tradition as recently as the Vietnam War. I feel like the power of the sort of the statement of, and again, in a moment of inspiration of naming the book, This Ground is Holy, of that notion of right or wrong, however the law defines it, somehow the sacredness of a religious and faith community and the protection that that would give, again, however you express that in law or historical tradition, I think was a really, really powerful statement that this was safe space that we might use in a more contemporary kind of way for domestic violence or for other kinds of contexts. But it was that the faith community, the church community, the religious community can provide that safe space. I think was a very, very powerful concept. And whether it was called sanctuary or not, I think that notion at that core was what really caught on.
And that's really strategy beyond, serving a family in need or even creating policy. The creation of safe space is a third kind of work.
Yes. And again, really then pressing those communities and congregations
to ask the larger question is,
if
we provide safe
space
space here, where else do we need to provide safe space, and where are the limits of it? What happened when people opened their eyes to that? Did it overwhelm them? Did they discover new tools for discernment? I mean, what did they do with that?
I think a lot of the congregations, again, all at different points in the journey had already been on that pathway and had been involved in a whole host of other issues. And again, Gus Schultz at University of Lutheran had been in an active anti-war sort of place in the Vietnam era, and before it declared sanctuary was involved in sort of peace movements and the Central American issues. And for other congregations, I do feel like afterwards there were those that then took on other issues, including some hard economic issues and other kinds of broader issues of social justice. And then others lost momentum or interest, and sort of things didn't continue. But for many, and others have joined more organized, faith-based kinds of community organizing networks as well. And again, some of them had already been part of those. But I also feel like the sanctuary movement and the engagement in the sanctuary movement also propelled others to join that.
It was a transforming encounter. It was an encounter through which people understood themselves in a different way and their faith. And then what they did with that later is, is thinking about how individuals and communities, what people do with transforming encounters. Right. It becomes part of them or it doesn't become part of them. And you were saying, some people, it was just the continuation or deepening of a path they were on, and for other people it was the beginning of a path of understanding. Did you see ways in which, you were talking earlier about the ways in which people became community? And part of becoming community is also the development of leaders. How did you see that happening in the sanctuary movement, and how was that connected with people's faith? Were there ways that people not only sustained, but strengthened or developed leaders?
So what was also felt different about sort of the movement, if one describes it that way, was it never had centralized leadership. There was no coordinating committee, no steering committee, no formal membership. And in that way, one might say then that might have in part led to its sort of dissipation over time, because it didn't have that kind of structure. But it also became a very spontaneous kind of thing that different folks in their own contexts and geographies were able to sort of join without feeling like they had those kinds of limitations. And so I actually feel like it was in that way more that people sought each other out, and I also think this is a way in which technology has now changed things, that today we'd all be connected by email and text messages, but at that point there was this virtual element to it, by phone, by other kinds of connectedness, that wasn't about membership in an organizational structure or some sort of formality.
Or an organic kind of
it was
development of
much
leadership.
more organic.
Right.
And in some ways, as well, one of the really interesting things was it was from much more the grassroots or the ground up. So it was much more individual churches and congregations and communities taking the concept on and exploring it and going through that process and reaching decisions, as opposed to a top-down, the U.S. Conference of Bishops debating it and then coming out with a policy statement. That again, or even again within the Catholic Church, even at the diocesan level, that the bishops would somehow take a position. It was just individual Catholic churches that just spontaneously, regardless of what the bishop said, sort of took the positions. And that again was a very, very different way of sort of things happening.
Part of this, but every one of these interviews builds on every one of these interviews, but one of the emerging concepts is this concept of creating a certain kind of space in which leadership can happen organically. That's, in some ways, a much more third world way of looking at leadership than the typical U.S. way of looking at leadership, which is also very enshrined in Alinsky, which is leaders are something you make versus leaders are something you create the space and they grow. It's a very different way of looking at leadership. It's very interesting. And it also sounds, let me check this out with you, but that some of the leadership was contagious in a way, that the Central Americans would demonstrate their leadership, and then other people would respond with their leadership. That there was a contagion of leadership also. That is very biblical.
Right. I'll also say that there was, and there eventually was another book documenting this, and so I don't take credit for it, but another one of my observations was the gender dynamics. That many of the visible spokespeople for the movement were male. And in my mind and in my observation, the people doing the work were women. And so, again, whether consciously or unconsciously, even and again, how much of that was sort of propelled by the individuals and sort of the movement, and how much of that, again, is who the media and others wanted to cover. But it was again, both going through the experience and then doing reflection about it afterwards. For me, the movers in the movement were women, and they often were people you didn't know, or whose names you didn't know.
And who maybe didn't even care whether you knew their names.
Yes.
That maybe that wasn't in their mind in terms of the development of their leadership.
Right.
A different understanding of leadership and what it meant. It's very, very exciting, very interesting. Because that is also a much more biblical understanding, actually, of leadership. That sense of the body, the image of the body of Christ.
Yep.
And every part of the body is equally important.
Yep.
And one part of the body isn't more focused on than others. Or if you focus on more, it's because it needs more, not because it's more important. This is an odd question, but I just feel like asking, so I will. What do you feel were some of the weaknesses in the movement? Or the unfinished places?
So, one, I actually do have a response to that. So one convergence, I would say, would be the best word, or development that never really happened, certainly at a national level, was the full integration of the Central American voice. So back to what I earlier said about that at least at least initially, almost objectify the Central Americans as, we need a family in order for us to do this. If it really is about the Central Americans, then it's not what you need, it's what they need. And so even that language was very, very off-putting. And I also reflect on back to that Tucson gathering where folks are freaking out about indictments and being arrested. And I've shared this with you before, and the fact that the meeting might be wiretapped and that their phones might be wiretapped by the FBI. And the Central Americans just rolled their eyes and said, we've suffered through kidnappings and torture and interrogation, and of course our phones are wiretapped. And they didn't use the word that I would use, which is chill, but it was chill out. We'll teach you how to get around all that. Don't worry about it. It's no big deal. And again, all these North Americans who were these do-gooders were completely freaking out. So I felt like that sense of really learning from the Central Americans and their experiences and their wisdom, and really becoming partners in the movement, never quite happened.
Never completely went
Never,
there.
right.
Well, the scriptural concept of the great reversal, that those who are despised are those who are lifted higher,
Yes.
which is the liberation theology,
Yes.
one of the major themes. It's very hard in our society to
Yes.
fully live that. It sounds like the movement pushed people in that direction, but how far could they actually go, and how fast could they go?
Yes.
That.
And if I were to fast forward, again, not just in
Yeah.
the Central American context, I felt like what happened in May of 2007 with the immigrant mobilizations around the country was that moment in which we as a country saw that power expressed, and then again didn't know what to do with it in that moment. And frankly, all the immigrant serving organizations and immigrant advocacy organizations also didn't know what to do with it, because it was the immigrants themselves that...
I don't know how much time we have left, but it's flashing,
Okay.
the battery.
Okay, then we'll do the final question, which is, you're speaking to young people, primarily, through this, who are going to take the movement for peace and justice in the faith communities into the 21st century. what are some words of advice that you'd like to give them?
Tough. Again, the most important advice that I always give is be true to yourself and listen to your own voice, because it often may be the voice of God speaking through you. And while listening to others around you for their wisdom and advice, the path that you walk is your own path. And
Okay. There's only 35 minutes on this one, which is good.
That's good. We won't actually use that many.
I think it's really crucial that leadership development not be thought of primarily in the traditional terms of how do you get ready to get out front, but as I said, the King model is, I think, a very helpful one. How do you get ready to really listen to the people? How do you get ready to have a sense of what it is that they are saying and where it is that they are hoping to go? Now, of course, this is not a kind of make-believe world, because there are going to be times when it's going to be absolutely necessary to enter into deep dialogue with the people about where it is that they say they want to go, and to ask questions about why and how and what does this mean. All of that is part of leadership in itself. I think that another of the great leadership models for me, it's a kind of a double model, and the two of them are really related to each other. Ella Baker of the Freedom Movement, who was so important in the shaping and encouragement of SNCC to become leaders themselves, and Bob Moses, who became one of those leaders who went far beyond that local situation where he started in Mississippi. But both Ella Baker and Bob, almost physically speaking, told something about leadership. Most often, you could tell that it was quite consciously they chose not to be standing in front of the audience. Almost always, both Bob and Ella would be seated someplace in the back and really encouraging others to say what they thought they needed to say and to make their proposals and to be the leaders. I think that that is a gift. Leadership development is a gift. It's not a technical skill. It's a gift, like dance is a gift, like poetry is a gift.